By 1948, Brenda was still having weekly choir rehearsals, enjoyed swimming, knitting and sewing, and was going to the cinema 2 or 3 times a week with friends. Her open, friendly nature in the telephone exchange ensured her popularity, and she was soon made social secretary, a post she probably relished, as it provided her with fresh opportunities to find the one, following the departure of the armed forces from Penwith. She arranged a joint dinner and dance with the men from Skewjack, the listening post at RAF Sennin, whose corresponding social secretary was a pleasant and handsome young lad called John Wootton. Brenda was a popular and very attractive girl, and as we've seen, had already had many boyfriends. She hadn't been backwards in coming forwards when the American soldiers arrived during World War II, but it was John who was to capture her heart. Unfortunately, her first meeting with John isn't recorded, as she gives up keeping her diary around that time, too busy doing other things, presumably. Johnny Wootton, as he was called then, had also had quite a few girlfriends in his home territory of Wolverhampton, where he'd lived prior to the war and his Cornish posting. His father, George Edward Wootton, was the gardener for both the Wolverhampton boys' and girls' grammar schools, and amazingly, he grew all the fresh fruit and vegetables for the school canteens. They actually lived in a cottage in the school grounds. John was a radio telecommunications technician for the RAF during the war and was stationed in Ceylon, and I'm very glad to say never saw active service, though he did, years later, receive the Standard War Medal. In contrast to the horrors of the war raging elsewhere, John's diary from the war years reveals a life of comparative calm and ordered routine in Ceylon. There were frequent visits to the cinema and occasional mentions of his work, but almost every day he records writing letters to a variety of girlfriends. Brenda, too, enjoyed the movies as a young girl. She has said, "The cinema was very important in my young life. It was in the Gaiety Cinema in Newlyn that I had my first grown-up date when I was 14 years old. He bought me chocolates and ate most of them himself." Brenda became engaged to John Wootton on her 20th birthday, the 10th of February 1948. In her diary, she records visiting the Gaiety again. "Saw ideal husband. Not as good as mine," she commented, anticipating her forthcoming wedding. The sheer volume of the correspondence between the young couple at that time was monumental. I still have over 100 apiece of their passionate daily tomes, covering the few months in 1948 and 49, when John still had to work out his job in Wolverhampton, both before and after the wedding, whilst Brenda remained in Daniel Place in Penzance with Lena and Angus. They were married in the Alexandra Road Methodist Church in Penzance on the 3rd of July that year, and honeymooned for a week in Stratford-on-Avon. Initially, John went back up to Wolverhampton alone and was later joined by Brenda, and for a short while the young couple lived on the grammar school site with John's father, George. Brenda found him somewhat curmudgeonly, so she was pleased to make the move back down to Cornwall in June 1949, just in time for a momentous event. In November 49, I was born, upstairs in Daniel Place in Penzance, with no midwife, but none the worse for that. I, too, am pleased that Brenda chose to return to Cornwall at that time, most likely remembering her own regretted accident of birth. For that first year back home in Cornwall, like so many young couples, Brenda and John lived with her parents, Lena and Angus, in Daniel Place. When browsing through Father's logbook from his earliest days as a radio ham, I was touched to see that there were a couple of occasions in the first year of their married life when Brenda was making some of the written entries. It appears the young bride was permitted to enter the inner sanctum of the shed and join in the fun. Well, the wheels soon come off that, as they say. Sennin, the first and last parish in Britain, straggles along the last few miles of road in the country before Land's End. It has 3 distinct and fairly self-explanatory areas. Residents were identified by their location, and at different times we classed as all of them. Churchtowners live anywhere in the region of the church, down towards Land's End. Covers live down in the cove itself, and Overillers live on top of the cove and back along the A30.